We are all becoming increasingly aware that what we call the science or art of medicine is coming inevitably to a dead end. This does not mean that the physician will no longer be useful or that there will no longer be need for healing on various levels of human need. The dead end is a materialistic limitation upon the concept of therapy. It is not going to be possible to continue to lock from our consideration those parts of man's constitution which are real though invisible. Nor shall we be able to indefinitely neglect an investigation of those forces around us, which, though unseen, have a continuing effect upon our lives. It is astonishing that our researchers in electricity have not done more for us in terms of open research into the field of electrical energy. We are still without an adequate definition of the word electricity itself. And we are certainly without an adequate understanding of the nature and substance of this energy. Assuming that such knowledge is not available to man, we have contented ourselves to define forces according to their actions or the consequences which they produce, and have been willing to remain indolent. Yet from early time, men have intuitively sensed that which they were not always able to rationally describe or explain. And among these who have possessed intuition on this subject, a quantity of knowledge has come to be accumulated. This knowledge is largely true, but this is one of those so-called unfortunate truths for those who have held to such truth are themselves persecuted, humiliated, or ridiculed. Like Paul, they belong to a generation of greater enlightenment than our own. Researches into the nature and substance of magnetism or related matter bearing upon this may be traced as early as the time of Pythagoras in the West, and was certainly known at a still earlier date in India and China. Yet it was not until comparatively recent time that any serious effort has been made to apply the principles set forth by these earlier thinkers to the living problems of modern man. One of the pioneers of this unfortunate truth of magnetism was the celebrated Anton Mesmer. Had an unfortunate personality, and this can often complicate the attainments of even the most brilliant and sincere person. Being somewhat of a controversialist, belligerent, and quick to anger, he brought down upon himself a great deal of unnecessary trouble in an area where there was sufficient necessary trouble to have occupied his time. As a result of his own somewhat theatrical bearing and flair, he opened himself to considerable ridicule and persecution. Yet substantially his findings have been sustained, and more serious, quiet, and demure persons have carried his work far beyond the degree which he had attained. Why Mesmer should have originally placed most of his essential concepts in cipher and code is not perhaps entirely clear. He may have had mercenary intentions, for he was not above such consideration. He may have decided that this type of information should be circulated only among those who were his students and to whom he would supply the necessary key to the code. Fortunately, of course, the code has long since been deciphered, and we are in fair knowledge of his essential findings. Mesmer advanced his principal beliefs in what are called 27 propositions. These unfold more or less sequentially his findings, and to read them is to recognize his indebtedness to the earlier works of Paracelsus von Humboldt. There is also a legend that the mysterious Count Saint Germain assisted Mesmer in the formulation of his doctrine. His findings were based upon the earliest concepts of magnetism that have descended to us from primitive peoples and from the oldest recorded times. It is not necessary for our purpose to examine all of the 27 propositions. But for sake of accuracy, I would like to read to you the first and second propositions, which I do think has a bearing upon our problem this evening. If I have any trouble in reading it, it's because I scratched it hastily and I'm not always able to decipher my own cryptogram. But I will do the best that I can. His first proposition is, there exists a mutual influence between the heavenly bodies, the earth, and living bodies. That is what he calls his first proposition. The second is the extension of this to the field with which we are concerned. A fluid, universally diffused and continued, so as to admit no vacuum, whose subtlety is beyond all comparison, and which, from its nature, is capable of receiving, propagating, and communicating all of the impressions of motion, is the medium of this influence. Now, these are his two basic propositions or hypotheses. He follows, as we have said, the concept of Paracelsus and the Arabs, that what we call the atmosphere, or the intervals between planets and suns on luminaries, that this entire area is filled with a mysterious fluidic substance. This perhaps is the famous ocean of Thales, upon which he believed the earth floated. And according to him, earthquakes were caused by someone rocking the boat. Now this might again be closer to the truth than we know if we consider this field of magnetic energy motion. It is already suspected that seismic upheavals may be due to electric or magnetic causes. This also may be the mysterious sea described by Heraclitus, who declared that souls coming into generation first passed into a strange, humid substance, moist but invisible, which enclosed the earth, and which, to a measure at least, communicated itself to the earth through the precipitation of rain. This humidity, carried by water, was, however, separate from and superior to the fluid in which it was carried. Socrates described water as consisting of a mass of minute, solid, dry units, and that the flowing of water was the falling of these units over each other in an endless concatenation. All of these speculations carry us likewise to the belief that the sun was the principal source and regulator of the magnetic fields of the solar system, and that by extension all energy or magnetic motion arose from the sun, and that its alternations, variations, polarizations, fluxes, and influxes were due to motions, tides, or various changes upon the sun or within the construction thereof. We would be inclined to go a little way along this road in recognizing the effect of sunspots, which would represent, therefore, some change upon the surface of the sun, which produced marked modification on the earth. All forms in nature exist within this humidic magnetic field. That all these forms likewise have a magnetism of their own, have their own magnetic fields, which are subservient to that of the earth and the sun, and also are subject to a certain modifying negative influence from that solar light which is reflected from the surface of the moon, which forms a different kind of magnetic energy. That the human body should be thus supported by a magnetic field was evidently known to peoples also in the past. Many individuals have existed who possess some degree of native psychism, who had a measure of vision beyond that of the more conservative human. These have recorded continuously through the centuries the appearance of a light, vapor, or field of energy surrounding the human body, which has come in mysticism to be called an aura, but which might just as easily be regarded as a magnetic field. Under certain conditions, almost anyone can, to a degree, perceive this aura, or can become aware and sensitive to its existence. And it is quite possible that this magnetic field is very important as a possible means of communication between man and other forms of life in nature, which communication up to the present time has been considered impossible. The magnetic field of the human body, as St. Thomas Aquinas pointed out, possibly basing his researches upon those of his teacher, Albertus Magnus, these fields in the body were subject to tides, were subject to motions of one kind or another. Albertus Magnus pointed out that the fluids in the brain were controlled also tidally by the motion of the moon. Thus it is conceivable that at least 3, probably more, types of pull or push pressures may be found operating upon magnetism. One of these, of course, is the sun, which in its motions and in its various internal mutations certainly affects magnetism, affects the earth in many ways, and it is probably the magnetic field rather than the actual light which is responsible for the phenomenon of the seasons. There is also a mutation or influence resulting from the reflection of light from the sun on the surface of the moon and its final descent to the earth. This type of magnetism has been noted to be noxious, and according to old magicians was used by sorcerers in the attainment of their diabolical ends. The third type of influence might arise directly from the earth itself, which has its own internal motions and mutations, and is subject, like all other living creatures, to gradual alternation of magnetic polarity. Thus we today recognize the 2 poles of the earth, one geographic and the other magnetic. The magnetic field of the earth has been considered to some degree. We are not entirely unaware of it, nor have we forgotten what the Chinese learned when they experimented with the compass. We know that magnetic currents of some kind do exist, but for some reason we have never directly attempted to apply them to therapy, except in the case of a few extraordinary and regarded as deranged researchers. The magnetic field of the body itself may therefore be similarly described as that of the sun, namely that it is a fluidic material, fluidic to our comprehension, but probably not fluidic in its own nature. It gives the impression of a fluid, but it is far more subtle than any fluid that we know. I think Mesmer termed it fluidic because he perceived within the substance of it certain tidal motions, certain ebbing and flowing, which we associate with a liquid of some kind. But it might just as well be associated with these magnetic patterns, which seem to lie beneath the surface of frost pictures on a window pane. Mesmer was convinced that this magnetic material formed not only a natural field around man, but was to large measure the basis of a certain protection. In other words, a person in whom the magnetic field was strong and was normally sustained apparently had greater resistance against the dangers of infection or many ailments which might otherwise afflict us. The reference to contagion and infection is rather important. We must assume that all forms of bacterial life, regardless of their size or structure, are also magnetic units. This does not mean they have no other existence, but it does mean that anything that exists does possess magnetism as a means not only of its existence, but of its animation. Thus also, infection may be said to have a magnetic existence, and the corruption of flesh is a magnetic process, just as surely as we might regard it as the result of poisoning, blood poisoning, or something of that nature. If, therefore, a person's magnetic field be strong, it is quite conceivable that it would repel the magnetic fields of bacterial organisms, causing some degree of immunity, if not complete immunity. And there are numerous records which cannot be explained of persons immune to ailments, who may even be carriers of those ailments, but will not be affected by them. The possibility of the magnetic field of the human body serving as a protection against evil is possible and quite probable. Also, that this magnetic field is further divided within itself, so that miniature fields surround all the principal vital organs and parts of the body, and that this magnetism moves in the marrow of the bones, and that it also flows through the nervous system. These points are worth noting. Mesmer himself directly associated magnetism with the nervous system, declaring that it definitely circulated through the body by means of the nerves, and that they contained within themselves this mysterious semi-fluid substance, invisible and entirely absent in the dead, but available in the living and controllable by those who knew how to operate the magnetic laws. Mesmer went still further in affirming that the principal source of derangements within the body might be claimed to have magnetic origin. Thus it would follow that the human being is not only subject to the law of nature, but is subject to the polarized activity of solar magnetism. Perhaps this is what Plato implied when he declared that the earth and its people pass through alternating periods of fertility and sterility, and that these periods correspond to the ages of the ancients. These periods may likewise correspond to the yugas of India, the divisions into various degrees of spiritual fertility with which the ancient Brahmins measured the duration of the world. In periods of sterility, as Plato points out, not only does vegetation and all of the natural qualities of the earth languish to some degree, but there is a marked deterioration in the life of human beings. In periods of sterility, he points out, there are not many great and true leaders. There are not many enlightened mystics and philosophers. There are few indeed great artists, musicians, and creators. In these periods of magnetic sterility, the human being loses something of his overtones, and therefore finds the struggle to solve the mystery of his own existence far greater than in more fertile periods. When, however, the solar system moves into an era of fertility, all things flourish, and the vegetation becomes more abundant. And with the vegetation, the consciousness of man becomes more notably elevated, and he is more creative and productive, not only in the physical matters of life, but in those which relate to the mind, the heart, the emotions, and the soul. If such periods in the magnetic field may be related to the sun, it is likewise evident that there must be lesser cycles moving within this greater one. One such cycle would be that of the moon, another of the earth itself, and still other cycles imposed by the very duration of the human structure and by the various seasons of man's life, as referable to the 7 ages of man and to the climacterics which mark the various divisions of human life. Thus, Mesmer tells us, the available magnetism at any given time may not be the same as at some other time. These currents, with their various tidal motions, may bring abundance or scarcity. And we might wonder, perhaps, the possible relationship between this humid or peculiar subtle fluid and the researches now being carried on in atomic fission. It is quite conceivable that if there should be damage or danger rising from the development of these electronic and atomic explosives, that this danger might lie in their disturbance of the magnetic field. If they succeed in disturbing the magnetic field of the earth, the effect will very likely be conveyed to the magnetic field of man. Therefore, he will not experience his difficulties from the outside, but will experience them in terms of his own available energy. And it has been noted even up to now that experimentation in this field has been accompanied by notable devitalization among many persons and has permitted ailments to advance more rapidly due to the devitality of the patient. All these matters must sometime come to general light, although they are now obscured by an indifference on the part of most of our learned people. Considering the problem of magnetism still further, Mesmer pointed out that just as the year has its seasons, so likewise there are seasons within the life of man. He is not only subject to the winter around him, but to winters within him. He is not only affected by the great cyclic motions of the universe, but by smaller cycles, based upon the fact that he is himself a miniature world, a microcosm, in whose constitution all larger processes are reproduced in miniature. There is also a sympathy between these larger processes and their miniatures in man, so that all of nature is bound together in one vast pattern and governed by rules for which there are no exceptions. The magnetic field of man is also, we are told by the ancients particularly, subject to the moods of man. And just as it is possible that universal mutations are due to universal moods of aspects of cosmic life or mind about which we have no comprehension, so it is more immediately demonstrable that the various changes in the attitudes and dispositions of human beings are immediately reflected in the magnetic field of the body, and that this reflection perhaps is the very basis of the operation of the law of compensation as this is applied to the activities and conduct of mankind. If then these magnetic fields can be distorted from their normal function, their motions, their rhythms, their ebbings and flowings disturbed by man's own contributions in form of mental or emotional intensity, it must naturally follow that we have here the basis for a morality. We have the basis for probably the most essentially certain code of conduct, which it is capable for us to know, or it's possible for us to know. For example, if any attitude results in an unfortunate mutation in the magnetic field, that attitude must be wrong, so far as man is concerned. Any thought or emotion which is harmful to his energy resources must be contrary to the intentions of the law by which he is controlled or directed. For all such negative mutations must contribute ultimately to sickness and possibly ultimate death. Thus, if man's conduct is under the censorship of its effect upon his magnetic currents, then we begin to perceive a means of clarifying or organizing a code which not only must apply to the relations between persons in this world, but must also protect the energy resources of the individual performing various actions or holding various attitudes. This, in turn, points up one of the strongest positions in the magnetic theory. The moment it is conceived to be possible that man's energies can be influenced by his conduct, we then begin to approach a field of therapy, for we have established a valid law, a law by which we can develop certain propositions, beliefs, ideas, formulas, methods for the practical administration of that law. We mentioned before this idea of the river and the water wheel, and that someone discovering the tide motions or the flowing of the river resolved to improve his own estate by putting a wheel there and allowing the waters to turn his wheel and thus activate certain instruments or implements which he used. In the same way, once we become aware of the laws of magnetism, we are able to use this substance for certain advantages. These advantages, we hope, will not prove to be economic, but they can very definitely contribute to our well-being or to advance some form of our way of life.